The December wind carried snowflakes through the downtown streets, each one catching the glow of holiday lights strung along the storefronts. Daniel Morrison walked with his 3 daughters pressed close against him, their mittened hands tucked into his coat pockets for warmth. The girls were bundled in winter coats, Lucy in burgundy, Emma in pink, and little Sophie in cream, their blonde hair escaping from beneath their knit hats. Daniel was 42 years old, with dark hair that showed just a touch of gray at the temples and the kind of steady presence that came from carrying responsibility alone. He'd been a single father for 3 years now, since his wife Rachel had passed suddenly from an aneurysm. Some days still felt impossible, but he'd learned to take life one moment at a time, finding joy in his daughter's laughter and strength in their need for him. Lucy was 9, thoughtful and protective of her younger sisters. Emma was 7, with endless energy and curiosity. Sophie, at 5, was still learning to navigate the world with the innocent wonder that made even grocery shopping an adventure. Together, they'd built a life from the pieces left behind. Not perfect, but filled with love. They'd come downtown to look at the holiday window displays, a tradition Rachel had started when Lucy was just a baby. Daniel had kept it going, understanding that some rituals were too important to let fade. The girls pressed their faces against the glass of each decorated window, pointing out details and telling each other stories about the scenes displayed inside. "Daddy, look at that one!" Sophie called, tugging his hand toward the bookstore window, where a miniature Victorian village was lit up with tiny lights. As they moved along the sidewalk, Daniel noticed other families doing the same thing, parents with children, grandparents with grandchildren, all bundled against the cold, all seeking the magic that seemed more present this time of year. The street was busy but not crowded, filled with the kind of gentle activity that made a city feel like a community. They were approaching Harrigan's department store, known for its elaborate window displays, when Daniel saw her. A woman sat in a wheelchair just outside the store's entrance. She wore a deep red coat that looked expensive but well-worn, and her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She was probably in her late 30s, Daniel guessed, with delicate features and an air of quiet dignity despite her circumstances. What caught his attention, though, was her hands. She was moving them in deliberate patterns, signing to the passers-by. Her expression was hopeful but tired, as though she'd been there for some time without success. Daniel had taken a sign language class years ago. Back in college, though, he'd forgotten most of it. But he recognized the basic gestures. She was asking for help. Most people walked past without acknowledging her. A few glanced over but quickly looked away, uncomfortable or uncertain. Daniel understood that impulse the modern world had made. People wary of street encounters, unsure of what was real need and what was something else. But there was something about this woman that made him pause. Perhaps it was the quality of her coat, which suggested this situation was recent rather than chronic. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with a kind of dignity that spoke of pride being overcome by necessity. Or perhaps it was simply that he'd learned, through his own grief and struggle, that life could reduce any of us to unexpected circumstances. He slowed his pace, and his daughters, sensing the change, looked up at him questioningly. The woman's hands moved again, and Daniel caught fragments of meaning. "Please," she signed, "help." Lucy had noticed her too. "Daddy, what's that lady doing with her hands?" "She's using sign language, sweetheart. It's how people who can't hear or speak communicate." Emma moved closer to her father's side. "Why can't she hear?" "Some people are born that way, honey. Some people become that way from illness or injury. But it doesn't make them less than anyone else. They just experience the world differently." The woman had seen them watching. Her hands moved again, more deliberately this time, and she made eye contact with Daniel. There was something in her expression, not desperation exactly, but a kind of quiet plea that spoke of circumstances beyond her control. Daniel felt his daughter's eyes on him, knew they were watching to see what he would do. This was one of those moments, he realized, where children learn by example rather than explanation. What he did next would teach them more about compassion and human dignity than any lecture ever could. He approached slowly so as not to startle her, and knelt down to be at her eye level. His daughters gathered behind him, curious and a little uncertain. The woman's expression shifted to surprise, then cautious hope. Her hands moved in a question, and though Daniel couldn't fully understand it, he got the general meaning. He held up his hands apologetically and spoke slowly, making sure she could read his lips. "I'm sorry. I only know a little sign language." "Not enough." She nodded, understanding, and reached into a bag beside her wheelchair. She pulled out a small notebook and pencil, her movements graceful despite what must have been cold, numbed fingers. She wrote something and turned it toward him. "My name is Catherine." "Read. I lost my hearing and use of my legs 6 months ago in a car accident. My insurance ran out. I'm trying to get money for medication and therapy. I'm not asking for much, just whatever you can spare. God bless you for stopping." Daniel read the note carefully, aware of his daughters reading over his shoulder. He looked back at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw beyond the immediate circumstances to the person beneath. He saw someone who'd probably had a very different life 6 months ago. Someone who was fighting to maintain dignity while asking strangers for help. Someone who reminded him, uncomfortably, that fate could turn on anyone at any moment. Sophie's small voice spoke up behind him. "Daddy, she's sad. Can we help her?" Daniel reached for his wallet, but even as he did, he knew that money alone wasn't really what was needed here. Money might help for a day, maybe a week, but it wouldn't address the real problem. This woman needed more than a handout. She needed someone to see her as a person, not a problem. An idea formed in his mind. It was probably impractical. It would certainly complicate his already complicated life. But sometimes the right thing to do was also the difficult thing to do. He took out a $20 bill and handed it to Catherine, but then he took her notebook and pencil and wrote his own message. "I'd like to help you properly. Would you come have coffee with me and my daughters? Let's talk about what you really need. No strings attached. I promise we're safe. My daughters will vouch for me." He turned the notebook to show her, watching her face as she read. He saw surprise, then suspicion, then a flicker of something that might have been hope tempered by experience. She looked at his daughters, who stood watching with wide, curious eyes. Lucy smiled encouragingly. Emma waved. Sophie simply stared with the unself-conscious directness of very young children. Catherine's hands moved, a question. Daniel shook his head. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." She wrote again. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know me." Daniel took the pencil. "Because 6 months ago you probably had a regular life. Because it could just as easily be me sitting there. Because my daughters are watching, and I want them to learn that we help people when we can. Because it's almost Christmas and nobody should be alone on the street." He paused, then added one more line. "Because my wife died 3 years ago, and I remember what it felt like when people helped us when we needed it most." Catherine read his words and her eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, then wrote, "Coffee would be nice. Thank you." There was a cafe just down the street, a place called Murphy's that Daniel and the girls frequented. It had big windows, comfortable booths, and a patient staff who didn't mind when Sophie spilled her hot chocolate or Emma talked too loudly. Daniel positioned himself behind Catherine's wheelchair, and she showed him how to release the brake and navigate properly. The girls walked alongside, chattering among themselves about this unexpected turn in their evening. Inside Murphy's, they took a large corner booth. Daniel helped Catherine transfer from her wheelchair to the bench seat, surprised at how natural it felt to provide assistance once she'd shown him how. The girls slid in on the opposite side, arranging themselves with Lucy in the middle, naturally taking on her role as the responsible older sister. The waitress Linda, who'd served them many times before, approached with menus and her usual friendly smile. If she was surprised by their unusual party, she didn't show it. Years of waitressing had probably taught her not to make assumptions about people. They ordered coffee for the adults, hot chocolate for the girls, and a selection of pastries to share. Catherine tried to protest the food, but Daniel waved her off. "You can't have coffee without something sweet. House rules." Once the orders were placed and Linda had moved away, Catherine pulled out her notebook again and began to write. Daniel watched her form the letters carefully, her handwriting elegant despite the awkward angle and the cold that must have made her hands stiff. "I don't know what to say except thank you. Most people won't even look at me. I've been out there for 3 hours today, and you're the first person to stop." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same one he felt whenever he encountered unnecessary human suffering. "Tell me what happened. If you're comfortable sharing." Catherine wrote for several minutes, occasionally pausing to sip the coffee Linda brought. Her story emerged in fragments, each sentence a small piece of a larger tragedy. She'd been a high school music teacher, specializing in choir and vocal performance. She'd loved her job, loved working with teenagers, loved the moment when a shy student discovered they could actually sing. She'd been engaged to a wonderful man named Peter, planning a summer wedding. Then came the accident. A drunk driver running a red light. Peter had been killed instantly. Catherine had spent 2 months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries. When she finally woke up fully, she discovered she'd lost her hearing, damage from the head trauma, and that the injuries to her spine meant she might never walk again. Her insurance had covered the initial hospitalization, but the ongoing therapy and medication costs had quickly overwhelmed her policy limits. She'd lost her job, not because the school didn't want her, but because she couldn't do the work anymore. How could she teach music when she couldn't hear it? She'd burned through her savings. Her parents were elderly and on fixed incomes, unable to help financially. She'd applied for disability assistance, but the system moved slowly, and in the meantime, she had bills to pay and medications to buy. So she'd started sitting outside stores asking for help. It humiliated her. Every day, it took everything she had to wheel herself to that spot and hold up her signs, but she didn't know what else to do. Daniel read her story with a growing sense of anger at the injustice of it all. This woman had done nothing wrong. She'd been living a good life, contributing to society, planning a future. And in one moment of someone else's terrible decision, everything had been taken from her. "I'm so sorry," he wrote when she'd finished. "For Peter, for everything you've lost. It's not fair, and I wish I could fix all of it." She smiled sadly and wrote back, "Life isn't fair. I'm learning that. But thank you for your kindness. This, sitting here, being warm, drinking coffee with people, this is the first normal thing I've done in months." Lucy, who'd been reading along quietly, spoke up. "Miss Catherine, can you teach sign language?" Catherine looked surprised by the question. She nodded and wrote, "Yes, I've been learning it myself. Why?" Lucy looked at her father, then back at Catherine. "Because maybe you could teach people. You can't hear music anymore, but you could teach people to communicate. That seems important too." Daniel felt a rush of pride in his daughter. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying went. It was such a simple, obvious idea, and yet Catherine's face suggested it hadn't occurred to her. Emma leaned forward. "Our school doesn't have anyone who knows sign language. I heard the principal saying she wished we did. Because there's a kid in 2nd grade who's deaf, and nobody can really talk to him except the special aid." An idea was forming in Daniel's mind, pieces clicking together like a puzzle. He wrote quickly, "Would you be interested in teaching sign language? Maybe privately, maybe in schools? There's definitely a need for it." Catherine stared at the words for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I never thought. I've been so focused on what I lost, I didn't think about what I could still do. Do you really think anyone would want to learn from me?" "Absolutely," Daniel wrote. "And I'll be your first students. Me and my daughters. We should know sign language. You never know when you'll meet someone who needs it." Over the next hour, over coffee and hot chocolate and gradually warming hearts, they sketched out a plan. Daniel would talk to his daughter's school about bringing Catherine in to teach sign language as an after-school class. He'd help her set up a small business offering private lessons. He knew people, parents from the school, colleagues from his work as an architect, friends from the neighborhood. He could spread the word, but more immediately, he offered something simpler. "My firm is starting a renovation on a community center. It's a 6-month project. They need someone to coordinate communication between the contractors, the community board, and our office. Mostly administrative work, scheduling, taking notes, organizing information. It doesn't require hearing. Just attention to detail and good communication skills. Would you be interested?" Catherine's hands shook as she wrote, "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to interview for one. There's a difference, but yes. If you're qualified and interested, I think you'd be good at it. The pay isn't amazing, but it's steady, and it comes with benefits, including health insurance." She put down her pencil and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, and Daniel realized she was crying. His daughters looked alarmed, but he gestured for them to stay seated. and simply reached across the table to put a gentle hand on Catherine's arm. After a moment, she lowered her hands and wrote through tears. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You don't know me. I could be anyone." Daniel took the pencil one more time. "You're not anyone. You're someone who had a life, lost it through no fault of your own, and is trying to rebuild. You're someone who's maintaining dignity in an undignified situation. You're someone who 6 months ago probably helped her students without thinking twice about it. Now it's your turn to be helped. Let people help you, Catherine. Let me help you." The interview happened 2 days later at Daniel's firm. Catherine arrived early, dressed professionally despite the difficulty of maneuvering her wheelchair through the snowy streets. Daniel had arranged for accessible transportation, making sure she didn't have to struggle alone. His boss, Martin Chen, was a practical man who cared more about competence than circumstances. He interviewed Catherine thoroughly, asking about her organizational skills, her attention to detail, her ability to work with diverse groups of people. He seemed satisfied with her responses, communicated through her written notes and Daniel's translation. "When can you start?" Martin asked at the end. Catherine wrote, her hand trembling slightly. "Immediately if you need me. Monday good for you? 9 o'clock?" She nodded, and when she looked at Daniel, he saw something he hadn't seen in their first meeting. Hope. Real, genuine hope that perhaps life could still hold possibilities. The weeks that followed were an adjustment for everyone. Catherine had to learn the rhythms of the office, figure out how to navigate her new responsibilities without hearing. But she proved to be exceptionally organized and detail-oriented, qualities that made her invaluable to the project. She communicated through email, through written notes, and increasingly through sign language, as Daniel and several other staff members began learning it. The girls started taking sign language lessons from Catherine on Saturday mornings. Daniel would drop them off at the small apartment the firm had helped. Catherine's secure, accessible, affordable, close to public transportation. He'd return a few hours later to find his daughters chattering with their hands. Excited by this new form of communication, Lucy took to it naturally, her thoughtful mind enjoying the puzzle of a new language. Emma approached it with enthusiasm, if not always accuracy. Sophie, at 5, learned the way young children do, through imitation and play, without self-consciousness or fear of mistakes. Daniel learned too, more slowly but with determination. He wanted to be able to communicate directly with Catherine, not through notes and lip reading. He wanted his daughters to see that learning never stops, that adults can still grow and change. As winter deepened into the heart of December, Catherine became a regular part of their lives. She joined them for pizza dinners at their modest house in the suburbs. She came to Lucy's school concert and Sophie's preschool holiday pageant. She taught Daniel's colleagues basic signs during lunch breaks, creating a small community of people who could greet her, thank her, ask how she was doing in her own language. The community center project progressed smoothly under Catherine's coordination. Martin Chen, impressed by her work, started talking about finding a permanent position for her once the current project ended. The cloud of financial desperation that had hung over Catherine began to lift. But more than the job or the money, what seemed to change most for Catherine was the isolation. She was no longer alone, no longer invisible. She had people who saw her, who valued her, who communicated with her as an equal. One Saturday afternoon in mid-December, after the girls' sign language lesson, Catherine gestured for Daniel to stay a moment. The girls went to play in the small courtyard outside her building, visible through the window, giving the adults a moment of privacy. Catherine pulled out her notebook, but instead of writing, she signed slowly, giving Daniel time to understand. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me, for helping me, for teaching your daughters to see people like me as people." Daniel signed back, his movements careful and deliberate. "You helped us too. You reminded us that kindness matters, that community matters, that we're all just people trying to get through life." She smiled and signed again. "Your wife, Rachel, she would be proud of the father you are." Daniel felt unexpected tears prick his eyes. He nodded, not trusting himself to respond immediately. Finally, he signed, "I hope so. I'm trying my best. Your best is very good." They sat in comfortable silence,